overthink it, just stand. Now sit back down. If you had to rock forward, brace on your thighs, grab the armrest, or push off with momentum, I want you to stay with me. Because that one movement, getting out of a chair, may be telling you something very important about the future of your strength, your balance, and your independence. Most people think leg weakness after 60 happens slowly and predictably. They imagine it as a straight line called aging. A normal, unavoidable slide. One year you feel strong, the next year you feel a little slower, and eventually you just accept that stairs are harder, curbs feel higher, and getting out of low chairs takes strategy. But that is not always what is happening. In many adults over 60, weak legs are not just the result of birthdays passing, they are the visible end result of a hidden physiological process that has been unfolding quietly for months or even years. The nerve signal gets weaker, the muscle contracts less efficiently, the muscle fibers themselves shrink, balance gets less reliable, recovery slows, and because none of that arrives with fireworks, most people dismiss it as just getting older, until the day the weakness finally announces itself with something serious. A fall, a fracture, a misstep, a terrifying loss of confidence. And that is exactly why this matters. Because once an older adult starts moving less out of fear, the body often enters a self-reinforcing spiral. Less movement means less stimulation to muscle. Less muscle means worse balance. Worse balance means more fear. More fear means even less movement. The decline starts feeding itself. The CDC reports that more than 1 in 4 older adults falls each year, and falling once doubles the chance of falling again. Falls also drive millions of emergency department visits annually in adults 65 and older. CDC. What makes this tragic is that, in a meaningful number of cases, the first cracks in leg strength are not random, and they are not always permanent. They are often amplified by correctable deficiencies, especially vitamin B12, magnesium, and vitamin D. These 3 nutrients affect 3 different layers of function. First, your nervous system has to generate and deliver a clear signal to the leg. Second, the muscle cell has to respond to that signal and contract properly. Third, the muscle tissue has to maintain enough quality and quantity to produce force, absorb impact, and catch you when you stumble. If any one of those layers weakens, your legs do not feel the same. If all 3 weaken together, what you experience is not just aging. It feels like heaviness, slowness, instability, poor coordination, difficulty rising, trouble climbing stairs, shaky legs, night cramps, numb feet, fatigue after small efforts, a growing sense that your body is no longer giving you the same support it used to. And because each of these nutrients works through physiology, not hype, not social media trends, but real biological mechanisms, this is one of the few conversations in senior health where understanding the mechanism can genuinely change the outcome. There is a concept often associated with biochemist Bruce Ames called the triage theory. When the body does not have enough of a nutrient, it prioritizes short-term survival over long-term maintenance. In plain English, your body protects what it must keep running today and cuts back on the systems whose breakdown won't kill you immediately. Over time, that rationing may quietly affect repair, resilience, and tissue quality long before a classic deficiency disease becomes obvious. PubMed.
So in this video, I want to walk you through what may really be happening inside aging legs.
I'll show you why weak legs are often not one problem, but 3 layers of physiology failing in sequence. I'll show you the simple home signs that suggest which layer may be struggling first. I'll explain the lab markers worth discussing with your doctor. And most importantly, I'll show you how to think about this in a way that is practical, not panicked, because the goal is not to scare you. The goal is to help you spot a fixable problem before it becomes a life-changing event. Let me paint a picture. Imagine a man in his late 60s. He still drives, still shops, still mows the lawn, still tells everyone he is doing pretty well for his age. But over the last year, he has started avoiding certain things. He parks closer. He chooses the elevator. He takes stairs one at a time. He no longer gets up from the couch without using one hand. He feels a little less steady in dim lighting. He has started placing a palm on the wall when walking down the hallway at night, not because he thinks of himself as weak, but because his body no longer feels automatic. That loss of automaticity is the warning sign. Healthy movement feels unconscious. You step up, step down, rise, pivot, turn, recover, catch yourself, all without thinking. Once you have to think about every step, something has changed. And here is what many people miss. By the time your movement feels different, the physiology behind it has often been impaired for a long time. Let's start with the first layer. Layer 1. The nerve signal. Your leg muscles do not work because they are attached to your bones. They work because your nervous system tells them to work. Every time you stand up, a sequence begins in the brain, travels down the spinal cord, runs through peripheral nerves, reaches the motor unit, and triggers muscle fibers to contract in a coordinated pattern. If that electrical message is strong, fast, and precise, movement feels stable and efficient. If that signal becomes delayed, noisy, or incomplete, movement becomes hesitant, inaccurate, and less safe. This is where vitamin B12 becomes critical. Vitamin B12 is essential for nerve health. One of the reasons is that B12 helps maintain myelin, the fatty protective sheath that surrounds nerve fibers. Think of myelin as the insulation around an electrical wire. When that insulation is healthy, the signal moves efficiently. When it is damaged, conduction becomes impaired. The message still exists, but it arrives later, weaker, or distorted. Clinically, B12 deficiency can cause numbness and tingling in the hands and feet, changes in balance, gait difficulty, and neurological symptoms that may occur even without anemia. NIH notes that methylmalonic acid, or MMA, is one of the most sensitive markers of B12 status, especially when a standard serum B12 result falls into a gray zone range. Niche odds. This matters enormously after 60 because leg weakness is not always true muscle weakness in the beginning. Sometimes it is impaired signaling. The person says, "My legs feel off. My feet don't feel normal. I'm not as steady. I trip more easily. I don't trust stairs in the dark." Those are not always muscle complaints. Often they are nerve complaints. And if the sensory nerves are affected, the problem becomes even more dangerous. Because walking safely depends on something called proprioception, your brain's ability to know where your limbs are in space without having to look at them. If the nerve quality drops, the body becomes less certain about foot placement. That is why some people with B12-related nerve issues feel especially unsteady on uneven ground, in low light, or when turning quickly. Their muscles may still be present, but the map is getting fuzzy. Older adults are already more vulnerable to B12 deficiency for several reasons. Absorption becomes less efficient with age. Some develop atrophic gastritis. Some produce less stomach acid. Some produce less intrinsic factor. Some eat less meat, eggs, or dairy. And some take medications that interfere with B12 absorption. NIH notes that vitamin B12 deficiency in older adults is common enough to warrant real attention, with estimates varying widely depending on how deficiency is defined. Knee odds. Now think about what happens when a person has even mild sensory loss in the feet. They don't necessarily say, "I have neuropathy." They say, "I'm a little clumsy lately. I catch my toe on things. I don't like walking in socks. I feel less stable on one leg. I need the railing now." That is why B12 deficiency can be so deceptive. It often presents like age, but physiologically, it is something else, a degradation in the quality of the signal. Now let's move to the second layer. Layer 2. The muscle cell's ability to contract and relax. Even if the nerve message arrives correctly, the muscle still has to execute it. And this is where magnesium becomes one of the most overlooked players in mobility after 60. Magnesium is involved in more than 300 enzyme systems in the body. It contributes to protein synthesis, nerve function, energy metabolism, and the movement of calcium and potassium across cell membranes, processes essential for nerve impulse conduction and muscle contraction. Knee odds. In practical terms, magnesium helps the muscle contract when it should and relax when it should. That second part is important. A healthy muscle is not simply a muscle that can tighten, it is a muscle that can cycle smoothly between contraction and relaxation. If relaxation is impaired, muscles feel tight, twitchy, cramp-prone, and easily fatigued. The person says their calves cramp at night, their thighs feel shaky after stairs, their legs feel heavy or dead after mild exertion. They don't necessarily describe classic weakness, they describe poor quality of movement. Here is why. Muscles feel shaky after stairs, their legs feel heavy or dead after mild exertion. They don't necessarily describe classic weakness, they describe poor quality of movement. Here is why. Muscle contraction depends on calcium entering the right places at the right time. Muscle relaxation depends on energy-dependent pumps restoring balance afterward. Magnesium is deeply tied to ATP-dependent processes, and ATP is the energy currency those pumps use. Without enough magnesium, the system becomes less efficient. The result can be cramps, tremor-like fatigue, poor endurance, and a feeling that the legs burn out too quickly. There is another reason magnesium matters so much in this conversation. It interacts with vitamin D. Many people assume vitamin D works independently. It doesn't. Magnesium helps regulate enzymes and pathways involved in vitamin D metabolism, and NIH explicitly notes that magnesium affects concentrations of the active form of vitamin D. NIAIDs. So when someone says, "I've been taking vitamin D for a year and I still feel weak," one of the questions is not only whether the dose is right, but whether magnesium status is adequate enough for the body to use that vitamin D properly.
And here is the subtle trap. Serum magnesium is the lab most commonly ordered, but NIH states clearly that serum levels do not accurately reflect total body magnesium levels or tissue concentrations, because most magnesium is stored inside cells and in bone, not floating in the bloodstream.
NIAIDs. That means a person can have symptoms consistent with low magnesium, a normal standard lab, and still not have great tissue-level magnesium status. This is one reason magnesium deficiency gets missed in older adults. Another reason is diet. Magnesium-rich foods, leafy greens, legumes, seeds, nuts, beans, are often exactly the foods that drop out of the diet first, when appetite declines, chewing becomes harder, or meals become more repetitive. And then there are medications. Some diuretics increase urinary magnesium loss. Long-term proton pump inhibitor use has been associated with hypomagnesemia strongly enough that the FDA issued a safety communication on the subject. FDA safety communication via referenced coverage. So if the person in front of you says, "My legs cramp every night. I get shaky after a short walk. My legs feel heavy. I fatigue too quickly. I'm taking vitamin D but not feeling better," you should at least think about magnesium. Not as a magic answer, but as a very real physiological bottleneck. Now let's go to the third layer. Layer 3. The muscle fibers themselves. The first layer was the signal. The second was contraction quality. The third is the tissue itself, the size, strength, and functional capacity of the muscle fibers that actually move you. This is where vitamin D becomes much more than a bone vitamin.
Most people know vitamin D in relation to calcium and fracture risk, but vitamin D receptors are also present in muscle tissue, and vitamin D status is linked to muscle function, falls, and sarcopenia risk in older adults.
The CDC even lists vitamin D deficiency among modifiable fall risk factors. CDC. Why? Because muscle is living tissue under constant turnover. It is always being repaired, remodeled, and either maintained or lost depending on the signals it receives. Vitamin D participates in cellular pathways relevant to muscle protein synthesis, muscle performance, and neuromuscular function. When vitamin D status is poor, the muscle does not maintain itself as effectively, and the fibers most vulnerable with aging are often type 2 fast-twitch fibers, the ones you rely on when you have to react quickly, catch yourself, step over an obstacle, or push powerfully out of a chair. Those are the same fibers that make the difference between a stumble and a saved recovery. So when vitamin D runs low in an older adult, the consequence may not feel like a dramatic illness. It may feel like diminished reserve. The person can still walk, still stand, still function. But they no longer have margin. They cannot recover from a missed step as quickly. They cannot generate force as fast. They cannot rise repeatedly from a chair without fatigue. They cannot regain balance as efficiently when perturbed.
That loss of reserve is what makes falls so dangerous, and falls are not trivial. Hip fracture in older adults is associated with high one-year mortality. Recent reviews report ranges roughly around 14% to 30%, with worse outcomes in men and with incomplete recovery common.
Fewer than half of survivors regain their pre-fracture functional status in many analyses. PMC review. That means the issue is not just discomfort, it is trajectory. A weak leg is not only a weak leg, it can become a weaker life. Now, I want to show you how these three layers often stack together in the real world. Imagine this sequence. An older adult becomes mildly low in B12. The feet become a little numb, balance becomes a little less precise. At the same time, magnesium intake declines, the legs start cramping at night and feeling more fatigued after mild exertion. Then vitamin D falls, the muscle fibers lose quality, and the person stops generating the same force they used to. None of those changes by itself may feel dramatic, but together, they create the exact person you see leaning on the grocery cart, taking stairs one at a time, pausing before standing, and reaching for the rail just to be safe. That person does not feel sick. They feel older. And that is why the problem gets missed. The two home tests that reveal a lot, let me give you two practical screens that are not diagnostic but they are revealing. The first is the 10-second single-leg balance test. Stand behind a sturdy chair or counter for safety. Lightly touch it if needed. Lift one foot and see whether you can balance on the other for 10 seconds. A 2022 study in the British Journal of Sports Medicine found that inability to complete a 10-second one-legged stance in middle-aged and older adults was associated with higher all-cause mortality over follow-up, even after adjustment for multiple factors. Important caveat, that does not mean the test causes mortality or predicts destiny on its own. It is a signal, not a sentence. But it tells you a lot about integrated neuromuscular function. PubMed. If this test feels surprisingly difficult, especially in a way that feels like uncertainty rather than raw strength, think nerve signaling, proprioception, and balance integration. The second is the 5-time sit-to-stand test. Sit in a standard chair, fold your arms across your chest if safe, and stand up and sit down 5 times as quickly as you can. This test is widely used in geriatrics and rehabilitation as a functional marker of lower extremity strength and mobility. Scores around 12 seconds and above are often considered concerning depending on age and clinical context, and inability to perform it without using hands is especially informative. Rehab measures. If this test is difficult, especially if the issue feels like pushing forcefully upward, think lower body strength, power, and muscle reserve. Write your times down, not because you are diagnosing yourself, but because what gets measured gets noticed.
And what gets noticed gets acted on. The medication piece almost nobody talks about. Here is where many health-conscious older adults get blindsided. They assume that if they eat reasonably well, no deficiency could be affecting them. But physiology is not only about intake.
It is also about absorption. Long-term proton pump inhibitors, the acid-reducing medications that often end in prazole, can interfere with absorption of nutrients including B12 and, in some cases, magnesium-related balance. The FDA has warned that long-term use can be associated with low magnesium levels. FDA-related coverage. Metformin, one of the most commonly prescribed diabetes medications in the world, is also associated with lower vitamin B12 over time. The American Diabetes Association has updated language around monitoring for B12 deficiency in long-term metformin users. ADA Standards 2025. So a person can do many things right and still develop a gap because the bottleneck is not what they eat, it is what they absorb. That is why medication review matters. Not to stop medications on your own. Never do that. But to ask better questions. What labs are worth discussing with your doctor? If this script describes you or someone you care about, the goal is not to self-treat blindly. The goal is to walk into a medical appointment with sharper questions. The labs worth discussing may include 25-hydroxy-vitamin D serum, vitamin B12 methylmalonic acid if B12 is borderline, or symptoms suggest functional deficiency magnesium, with the understanding that standard serum magnesium has real limitations for reflecting total body status. Ni-odds B12. Ni-odds magnesium. Some clinicians also use RBC magnesium in practice, though test selection varies and interpretation should be individual. The American Diabetes Association has updated language around monitoring for B12 deficiency in long-term metformin users. ADA Standards 2025. So a person can do many things right and still develop a gap because the bottleneck is not what they eat, it is what they absorb. That is why medication review matters. Not to stop medications on your own. Never do that. But to ask better questions. What labs are worth discussing with your doctor? If this script describes you or someone you care about, the goal is not to self-treat blindly. The goal is to walk into a medical appointment with sharper questions. The labs worth discussing may include 25-hydroxy vitamin D serum, vitamin B12 methylmalonic acid if B12 is borderline, or symptoms suggest functional deficiency magnesium, with the understanding that standard serum magnesium has real limitations for reflecting total body status. NIODS B12. NIODS magnesium. Some clinicians also use RBC magnesium in practice, though test selection varies and interpretation should be individualized.
The point is simple. If your legs are changing, ask whether anyone has actually looked for reversible contributors. Because guessing wastes time. And with mobility, time matters. The big mistake careful people make with vitamin D. Now let's talk about the mistake. A lot of very conscientious people discover that vitamin D matters, and they jump straight to high-dose supplementation for long periods, without first checking status, reviewing cofactors, or thinking about context. That is not always wise. More is not always better.
Some research on high intermittent vitamin D dosing in older adults has found paradoxical increases in falls compared with more moderate approaches. This is one reason why test, interpret, personalize is smarter than megadosing blind. And vitamin D does not act alone. Magnesium status matters. Overall calcium handling matters. Total diet matters. Kidney function matters. Medication context matters. So if someone says, "I'm taking huge doses of D and still weak," the answer is not necessarily take more. The smarter question is, what is my actual level? What is my absorption situation? And what else in the system is missing?
That is how physiology works. Systems, not shortcuts. What to do starting now. So what should an older adult actually do with this information? First, do not panic. Second, do not treat a YouTube script like a prescription. Third, do not dismiss the signs. If rising from a chair is harder, if balance on one leg is worse, if your feet feel numb, if your legs cramp at night, if stairs suddenly feel like work, if you are moving less because your legs feel unreliable, that is worth attention.
Start with the basics. Notice your pattern. Measure what you can safely measure. Write down your symptoms in plain language. Numb toes, poor balance in the dark, calf cramps, heavy legs, slower stair climbing, need to use hands to stand, fatigue after short walks. Then bring that list to your clinician. Ask about B12. Ask about vitamin D. Ask about magnesium. Ask whether your medications could be contributing. Ask whether your weakness sounds more neural, muscular, or both. And while you are doing that, remember something crucial. Nutrients alone do not build strong legs. They support the biology that allows legs to stay strong. But muscle is use-dependent tissue. That means the body maintains what it is asked to keep. So if your doctor says it is safe, combine nutritional correction with regular lower body use, sit-to-stands, walking, step practice, gentle resistance training, balance training, adequate protein, and consistent daily movement. Because the signal to preserve muscle comes partly from nutrients, but also from demand. If you stop demanding strength, the body stops investing in it. That is the cruel logic of aging physiology. But it is also the hopeful part. Because the reverse is true too. When you nourish the nerve, restore the mineral balance, improve vitamin D status where deficient, and ask the muscle to work again, older bodies often respond better than people expect. Not overnight. Not magically, but meaningfully. And sometimes that is all the difference in the world. Sometimes meaningful means the person who was using 2 hands to stand can rise with 1. Sometimes it means fewer cramps. Sometimes it means walking farther without that heavy, unreliable feeling. Sometimes it means enough balance to stop fearing the curb outside the pharmacy. Sometimes it means catching the problem before it becomes the fall that changes everything. That is why this matters. Weak legs after 60 are not always just age. Sometimes they are physiology asking for help. And if you can hear that message early, before the fracture, before the hospital, before the loss of confidence, you may be able to change the story.
So here is the takeaway I want burned into your mind. Your legs depend on three things: a clear signal, an efficient contraction, and enough healthy muscle tissue to produce force.
Vitamin B12 protects the nerve side of the system. Magnesium supports the contract and relax machinery and helps regulate vitamin D biology. Vitamin D supports muscle quality and reserve. When those layers weaken, the body does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers. It whispers through the hand on the armrest, through the toe that catches the rug, through the wall touch in the hallway, through the slowed rise out of a chair, through the sentence, "I'm fine, I'm just getting older." Listen to those whispers early enough, and they may stay whispers. Ignore them long enough, and one day they may become a siren. If this script helped, share it with one person over 60 who has started saying their legs feel different, not injured, not paralyzed, just different. Because that vague change, that almost invisible shift in confidence and power, is often the exact moment when action still works best. And if you want, I can turn this into the next layer for you, a more emotional YouTube script with stronger hooks and retention loops, a clean doctor-style version, a viral faceless video version with pattern interrupts, or a 15-minute version with CTA, B-roll cues, and thumbnail title ideas. Source notes used for the physiology and claims: falls among older adults, including more than 1 in 4 older adults falls each year, CDC fall burden, and vitamin D deficiency as a modifiable fall risk factor come from the CDC Older Adult Falls data page. CDC, vitamin B12 deficiency risk in older adults, neurologic symptoms, and use of methylmalonic acid as a sensitive marker come from the NIH Office of Dietary Supplements fact sheet on vitamin B12. NIODS, magnesium's role in muscle and nerve function, its relationship to the active form of vitamin D, and the limitation of serum magnesium as a reflection of total body magnesium come from the NIH Office of Dietary Supplements fact sheet on magnesium. NIODS, the one-leg balance study connecting inability to hold a 10-second stance with higher all-cause mortality risk, was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine and indexed on PubMed. PubMed, the clinical framing of the 5-time sit-to-stand test and the approximate concern threshold around 12 seconds, comes from the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab Rehab Measures database. Rehab Measures. Recent review data on 1-year mortality and incomplete recovery after hip fracture in older adults comes from a 2025 review in Medical Sciences, PMC. Bruce Ames's triage theory background is reflected in the literature discussing how moderate micronutrient deficiency may shift biological priority away from long-term maintenance. PubMed. Long-term proton pump inhibitor use and low magnesium risk are reflected in FDA-related safety reporting. Helio summary of FDA communication. Updated language around long-term metformin therapy and vitamin B12 deficiency appears in the 2025 ADA Standards Revision Summary. ADA